Hi, guys. Welcome to our afternoon tea light. We are here in June. I can't believe it's June already. We have Fiona Davis with us today. I'm so excited. I hope you guys are too. I wanted to share with you a little bit about her before we get the chance to talk to her. Fiona Davis is the New York Times selling author of 6 historical fiction novels set in iconic New York City, including the Magnolia Palace, the Dollhouse, the Address, and the Lions of Fifth Avenue, which was a Good Morning America book club pick. Her novels have been chosen as One Book, One Community Reads, and her articles have appeared in publications like the Wall Street Journal and the Oprah magazine. Raised in Canada, New Jersey, she came to New York as an actress, but fell in love with writing after getting a master's degree at Columbia Journalism School. Her books have been translated into over a dozen languages, and she's now based in New York City. So welcome. There we go. I got you now. Hey.
How are you? Thank you so much for this. It's fantastic.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, we've got a couple people saying hello. We've got Susie Baldwin from Seattle, and we've got hi, and we've got Mike Lee. Hi from San Jose. Fantastic. Same one. Oops, sorry about that. All right. So, and we have an unknown Facebook user here from South Carolina. Just so you guys know, if you want to put your name up through Facebook, you can always go to that website, chat.restream.io/FBTO, and it will identify you so we can actually see your name when you chat. So, yeah, we've got a couple more here. Oh, Susie Baldwin says,
Yeah.
I love all of your books, as you know. So you've got
We
got someone from Nebraska. Oh, that's fantastic. All over the place.
Look at this. This is fantastic.
Yeah, it's great to have so many people coming in from so many different places. That's wonderful. So your most recent is The Magnolia Palace, which was a fantastic read and about the frick. I guess you could. Can you be casual with it and just say the frick?
Oh, okay. Absolutely. We do that in New York all the time. The frick. It's like the Met. The frick.
Yeah. You could just say that. All right. Well, good. So it just came out in February.
At the end of January. Yeah.
January. Yeah. I have no concept of time, so I'm terrible.
Right.
Yeah.
Time it was cold. I remember it was cold when it came out.
So, and it seems like it's been getting really great reviews, and it's got a really good reception. Oh, and we've got another, sorry, you've got a lot of hellos today. So Anissa in South Carolina.
Anissa, yes, fantastic.
Great. So one thing, since you write about buildings, particularly in New York City, but New York City has had so many different reputations over the decades. In the 1970s, it was gritty. You've got Escape from New York. So were there any challenges in having to overcome the other reputations to bring out this like Gilded Age sense of wealth and cleanliness?
Yeah. Although I think there were probably during the Gilded Age, the streets were filled with manure, so it wasn't. It was pretty dirty and gritty even then. But yeah, that's what I love about writing historical fiction is that you capture the cycles of history, and it does seem like we cycle over and over. So New York, like any city, has these really high highs where everything's going well, or at least, there's a lot of ostentation and a lot of wealth that's very obvious. And so you have that in the 1880s and, pretty much throughout when the Fricks were here, and they came in the 1910s. So it was a little later. But then, it went into the Depression, and then in the 50s it came out, and then in the 70s it dove back down. But then the 80s you had yuppies. So it's just this really interesting thing, especially because at this point I think I've covered every decade since 1880, and each one has its own personality. And so, yeah, for me, it's so funny. I very recently, a friend, an architect friend, sent this article written in the late 1960s about the Upper West Side of Manhattan, which is where I live. And it was all about how it's up and coming, that, it was such a mess and very dangerous and crime ridden. And now it's, slowly coming back. And the Upper West Side is a beautiful place to live these days.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I have to make sure I put my head in the right decade as I'm writing, that I've done enough research that I can have specific things that come out that hopefully ground you at that time, and that I don't pull any kind of anachronisms or anything from modern times into old New York, because you don't want to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Makes sense. Um, so then this just leads me into a question that I was going to wait a little bit longer before I asked it, but I'm just going to ask it. So does that mean your next book is going to be in the 1920s, since this one was the 19 teens?
You know what? Then the 20s, I covered that in the masterpiece, which is set at Grand Central Terminal. And that's set at an art school that was actually there, that was co-founded by John Singer Sargent in the 1920s. And so
Oh.
that was kind of late 20s to early 30s. So in fact, I'm going back to an old time period that I've done before, in the Dollhouse, which was my first book, which is the 1950s for the next book. It'll be set in 1956. And
Oh, wow.
I do these dual timeline things, and that book will have um, a few scenes in modern times
Mhm.
from a woman looking back at what happened to her in the 1950s.
Oh, fantastic. I'm really interested in that. It feels like we've done World War II so hard in historical fiction that it's kind of nice. The post-war is nice to get to, you know?
Yeah. 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 And that's what's fun with these, because, with the Magnolia Palace, I was doing 1910. So one set in 1919 and the other timeline set in 1966. And those are two very different time periods in New York. And it's really fun to show how women, like, for example, the woman Helen Frick, who's a main character in the 1910s section, she's this woman who's very dynamic and very strong-willed, almost overly so, and very privileged.
Mhm.
And she's stymied in many ways because, back then in the 1910s, men made the decisions for you. And so it's interesting to think about what she would have been like if she'd been born later and had
Mhm.
all this passion and all this drive and had somewhere to really, put it. And she did. She had amazing accomplishments, Helen Frick, absolutely. But she was a really complicated woman. And so it's really fun to think, okay, that's what it was like in 1919. But what it would have been like for a woman in the 60s instead? What opportunities might she have had?
Well, and it's interesting too with how you present Helen Frick, she has the money, she has the privilege, but she doesn't have the face. And so
Mhm.
you've contrasted her with two women who are valued by their looks. And so, which is another way that women are evaluated. So they have power in their beauty, but it doesn't come to much for them really. And so
Yeah,
it's juxtaposition that way.
yeah, that's absolutely true. They're both models. So one is a model um, for sculptors in the 1910s, and she's modeled after an actual woman named Audrey Munson, who I can tell you all about.
I'm all
And
I would love
okay,
to documents.
yeah, I love the way you put that. It's so true that two of the main characters, Veronica in the 60s and Lillian, excuse me, in the 1910s, they're both models. So they're both looked at and evaluated in that way. And then you have Helen Frick, who was, she had this crazy wild frizzy hair. She was a little old-fashioned in her ways. And yeah, she just wasn't, the society beauty that
Yeah.
people expected of a daughter of a very enormously wealthy man.
Mhm.
She kind of eschewed all that. And yeah, so just to talk a little about Audrey Munson, she's carved. If you look at the book at the very cover, above the doorway to the Frick, there's a woman carved in stone above the pediment. You can see her right there. Yeah, she's carved in stone there. It's a reclining nude.
Mhm.
And um, and she was the supermodel of the 1910s. She had this incredible life. She was very popular. She was very, very beautiful, known for the dimples on her lower back. And she can be found everywhere around New York today. She's at Columbus Circle.
Mhm.
There's statues of her. She stands in front of the New York Public Library, in front of the Plaza Hotel, in front of the Brooklyn Museum. Her statue is everywhere. And you walk by it and you just don't think twice about who was the woman who posed for that. And it was this woman, Audrey Munson, and she, got into this huge scandal with her landlord that drove, which is covered in the book, and then that drove her and her mother upstate New York, where she just didn't do well. She tried to get into silent films and it didn't work. And here's where my character and the actual Audrey Munson kind of fork. There's a fork in the road there because I needed to make my character do things that weren't part of Audrey's life, which is why I renamed her Lillian and made it very clear in the author's note what's
Mhm.
fact, what's fiction. But the real Audrey Munson went off and she just didn't do well. She tried to die by suicide by drinking mercury.
Oh.
And eventually her mother put her in an asylum where she died in 1996 at the age of 104.
Oh, goodness.
And at that time, she was buried in an unmarked grave. And I just thought, here's this woman who's been lost to history and really overshadowed by the men in her
Mm.
life, just the way Helen Frick, was very much overshadowed by her father, who was this very powerful steel magnate who, was ruthless and very tough. And so that was really interesting to kind of bring out of these women who are used to being looked at, and what's the difference between being looked at and being really seen. And that's where those three women really explore that in the novel in a way I hope that is compelling and drives the story forward with a couple good plot twists.
Yeah. I really actually really enjoyed that just because of man, I'm going to put our spoiler alert up here just so that
Yeah, spoilers.
anybody who hasn't read the book, just mute for a second. And then when I take the spoiler alert off, then you can listen.
That's hilarious.
Just because I don't want to ruin it for anyone. So, one of the things that I found most compelling is that when her father dies, that she says, "Oh no, we're going to take his bed and into my room. I'm going to have his bed now." And I thought that was a really beautiful moment of Helen being able to grab her agency. That she had spent her entire life trying to please a man that could not be pleased. And so she's, "Oh, who's the boss? I'm the boss." And I just really loved that moment of grabbing power in a most literal way.
And what's interesting is in that, according to the biography I read, really happened. She and her father were incredibly close, and but yet at the same time fought and had a very passionate relationship, you might say. So yeah, that's right. She was like, "Get this done." Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And actually, while we've got the spoiler alert up, all my spoilers. So the other thing I thought was really interesting is that you did have long-lived old ladies in this book. So the ending is really critical that everyone is still alive in 1966.
Yeah. And then that's what I had to be very careful about because I wanted the two storylines to connect at the end, and I knew early on what that connection would be. So yeah, it's a matter, and Helen Frick lived for a long time. I think she died in the 80s or 90s even. So she lived a long time. Audrey Munson lived a long time.
Yeah.
And so the character that's based on her also did. Yeah, because you can really see how the building especially changed over time, where it was this residence for this family of 3 that were served by a staff of 27 in the 1910s. And then what was it like as a museum, which is where our model Veronica is trapped for 3 days during a snowstorm.
Yeah. And so I also have to ask about the diamond, the Magnolia diamond in your book. So is that a real thing? Is that a real?
No, that is made up. And I try and make it really clear in the author's note, because I do worry about people going, the whole book, for anyone who hasn't read it, is kind of about a scavenger hunt that leads you through the artwork of the Frick and, in the hopes of finding this very valuable diamond. And I didn't want people going to the Frick and trying to find it in the hidden panels, which the hidden panels do exist that I described, but there's no diamond. And
Okay.
what was interesting was, as I was writing it, well, I write it and then all of us, my agent, my editor, we brainstorm to come up with a title. And that's always the hardest part for every book because you need a title that refers to the building and to the plot. And
Hmm.
so there are these three beautiful magnolia trees outside of the Frick. And I thought, okay, we'll work that in Magnolia Palace. And at that point, the diamond in the book was just a diamond. And so that's when I changed it to a pink diamond and
Very,
called it the Magnolia Diamond. And suddenly it just created a life of its own.
yeah. Okay, so I'm going to take the spoiler alert off. So anybody, you can jump back in. We have a question from Anissa who says, which scene was the hardest to write and why?
Oh, yeah. Um, that's a really good question. I'll tell you, I'll first start by saying the most fun one to write was the one that takes place in the Fragonard room, which is a very famous room at the Frick. And that's where Helen Frick and our character Lillian, who's the artist's muse, first meet and have this interview. And what's happened is, poor Lillian's been drawn into the museum, into the house accidentally, really. It was a mistake, and doesn't realize she's being interviewed to take the position of private secretary to Helen Frick. And they both have this love of art, which is in the end what gets her the job, even though she'd be a terrible secretary. And Helen kind of likes the fact that she's very, she's a little perverse in that way. And that scene was just so fun to write because it really shows you what Helen Frick is like. It shows you the dire straits that Lillian is in and how much stems on this decision that she's about to make. And yeah, the hardest might be at the very end when you're trying to kind of pull all the strings together and explain everything and have all the blanks filled in and give an ending that's moving and that those are tough because you're working on character, you're working on plot, and you're trying to make sure you've covered all the bases, that there's no unanswered questions.
Hmm. Yeah. Oh, Susan. Oh, she's got a long one here. She says, I've read all of your books and I love how the landmark locations become characters in your stories. How do you get your ideas for each book and how do you zero in on the setting for each story?
Yeah. Each book has come about a different way. And really what's happened is I don't think ahead. If I'm working on one book, I don't have like 4 locations lined up that I'll just, work on. I wait until that book's over and then I just let things kind of come to me. So for example, for the masterpiece set at Grand Central, I was finishing up a book and someone said to me at a book talk, I can get you a behind the scenes tour of Grand Central. And I thought, okay. And suddenly I did research and came up with a fun story idea and I was off to the races. For the last book, The Lines of Fifth Avenue, it really came from doing author talks around the country and having reader after reader come up to me and say, you should do the New York Public Library. And I thought, okay, there's so many people telling me this. I should probably look into it. And I'm so glad I did.
Yeah.
Because that's where I learned that when it was built, they built this apartment deep inside it for the superintendent and his family to live in. So, a family living in a library, I was like, yep, that's great. I'm done. And so each one's come about. And so I'll tell you a little about the book that I'm working on now that will be out next year. And
Yeah.
that's Radio City Music Hall. And that came up from a reader reaching out to me through my website and saying, I'm in my 80s, I'm a former Rockette. And if you want to know all the secrets about Radio City, you should reach out to me. And she'd been doing lectures about her time as a Rockette. So she had all this information and resources and an archive, really, that she very kindly sent to me and really formed the basis for the book that I'm working on now.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Well, there was a couple of comments early on that they were very excited. Other people know about your Radio City book and are very excited to read it. So you've already got built in.
Yay.
Susan Seligman says, I think Lines of Fifth Avenue is my favorite. Is at the library or bookshop, I'm all in.
Yes. And there's so many good books out right now, actually set in bookshops. You have The Paris Bookseller by Carrie Mayer. You have Bloomsbury Girls.
Yes.
Yeah, I have it right over there. There's so many great books that are all set in bookshops. It's fantastic.
Yeah, no, it really is. Well, just to kind of go on to a little bit of a different I don't know, a different venue here, a different way to talk about it. So you actually started your career in an entirely different field.
I know. I know. I know.
How
I
did you
did.
get? How did you get- I mean, I'm
Yeah.
the same, but like, what got you over here? How did
Yeah.
we?
It was quite circuitous. I came to New York as an actress, and I worked doing Broadway and off Broadway and regional theater for about 10 years. I worked with a theater company full of my friends, and we would, perform shows off Broadway. It was just so much fun. It was great.
Mhm.
But as I started getting into my late 20s, I found that my girlfriends who were a little older were having a hard time getting roles. And this is back in the 90s. This is a long time ago. And then all my guy friends who were actors were, aging into these great character roles. And I thought, well, that's not fair. So maybe there's something else I should do.
Yeah.
And I applied to Columbia Journalism School just because I thought, okay, you know what I did? I actually went to like NYU Career Services or some random place, and you did the Briggs Meyer test, which
Yeah, I remember 90s.
remember that? And it was a test to show what you should go into. And this is back in the 90s. So it was before you used an internet or anything. So you would go down, you took this long test. And I remember getting the thing back and it was like, oh, you should be a policeman or a journalist. I'm like, okay, really, policeman? No. Um, and so I thought, okay, journalist, that could be fun, right? You get to cover stories and things and write. And so I applied to Columbia Journalism School and got in and did a master's there, which was fantastic. It was a year-long program. It just opened my eyes to this whole new way of looking at the world and writing about the world. And so then I did that. I was a freelance journalist and worked a little bit on the Channel 13, the local 13 channel here. And then eventually a story idea came that became my first book, The Dollhouse. So it was it felt like every 10 years I was making a career shift. And I highly recommend it,
Yeah.
because now I'm doing something I absolutely love. And it really feels like a culmination of all those
Mhm.
other careers. All of those work to fit into writing historical fiction.
That's fantastic. So how did you get from having your idea? Because I know we have a lot of um, authors in here who are still trying to figure out their publishing path. So how did you get to your publishing path? I mean, I think being in New York City, you get to meet a lot more agents than if you live anywhere else.
You know what I did is I knew no one in the industry, and being a journalist is completely different from the fiction world. So there's no, crossover. And so as I was working on this book, I started going to conferences and things. And so if there was a panel of agents, I just wanted to learn about the industry and how do you write a book. I read all the Stephen King, Bird by Bird. Elizabeth George has a great book on writing mysteries, and I just devoured them. I'm a very good student. I love. That's why I went back to school. I think I just love ingesting information. And I remember going to a panel, and it was a panel of agents, and one of them mentioned, if I'm looking for strong female characters, and I just thought she sounds like a really good fit. So when the book was ready, I reached out to her and I mentioned that I'd seen her in a panel, I'd heard her, this is what she'd said. And I think that was just enough to get me through the door that
Mhm.
she would consider reading it. And I was very lucky where she loved it and called me and said, yep, we have a lot of work to do on this. Cause again, it was my first book. I didn't know what I didn't know,
Mhm.
but we worked together and it was a great experience. And suddenly, yeah, that book got picked up and it got a lot of attention, which was really nice. I think the timing of it just worked out well. And then, yeah, we were off to the races. So it was really learning everything I could about the industry. And that's what I recommend, before you send off your manuscript to random agents, you need to know who they are, you know, who do they cover, make sure your pitch is very specific to them.
Mhm.
You only have one chance to sell that manuscript. And if I could go back, I would have made sure my manuscript was in better shape than it was. It was a really good idea, but it needed a lot of work. And I didn't know that.
Oh, interesting. That's an interesting point.
Yeah.
Hmm. So, do you feel like you had ever been judged because you had so many different careers? Do you feel like people were like, "Oh, you're just being a dilettante right now"? Have you ever had those kinds of issues?
Yeah, when you're an actor in your 20s in New York, people are like, yeah, sure. And it's just so easily dismissed because there's so many actors in New York, and everyone's trying really hard to get jobs and get an agent and all that kind of thing. But yeah, once I became a journalist, it was easier to get my foot in the door, and I learned how to ask questions and how to approach people and get answers. And that really helped when it came to writing books because all my books are heavily researched and not just on the internet. I'm going out and interviewing experts, interviewing historical or architectural historians. What are the stories I need to do? What are the details that have to be right? And the journalism degree helped me figure out how to do that.
So to go back to the Magnolia Palace then, so who did you interview for that book? And
Yeah. Yeah, that was great. There are great archivists at the Frick. And so it was during lockdown, so it was a little tricky, but they could send me things like, here's the payroll with all of the servants, what they did, what their names were, what their nationality was, where they were paid. And because it really is this little city, the Frick, when it was a residence, I had to really try and create that. Okay, there was an organist, there was the vegetable maid. Like,
yeah, that blew my mind.
yeah.
'Cause I used to play organ. It's a very
Oh,
instrument. I was my path is not unlike your path. It's just I was a musician as opposed to an actress. And
totally get it. Yep.
yeah, so I was, and I was an organist, and yeah, it is a challenging instrument. So the idea of it being in a house, like even if it's a big house, like if you have a big organ, that's really noisy. It's a whole lot.
Right. And the pipes that were embedded into the walls. And then there's this entire room of pipes
Yeah,
just for the organ room. You need to have space for that.
yeah. Well, I mean, having been in those kinds of rooms and other places, like I actually really did have a very good visual of that, of like, oh, I've been in one of those.
I
But
love that. Yeah.
yeah,
And Mr. Frick liked to have the organ played during meal times. That was just his thing.
all I can think of is like, I guess maybe the lowest register, like, the biggest, whitest pipe. I mean, I guess that might help your digestion a little, just like
Exactly.
rations. I don't know.
Exactly. Yeah, so it was, that they were very helpful, and I interviewed the some of the people who worked at the Frick, including a former director at the Frick who is now at the Morgan Library. He was very kind to give me his time. And so I got some really good inside scoop on the building and the family. And then it was a lot of reading biographies and filling it all in that way.
Mm. To go back to the questions here from people, Susie Baldwin wants to if there's any interest in any of your books. So, yeah.
That would be great. There's a real demand for content right now, and I love the way all of these books that are coming out are getting picked up. And I think things like the Queen's Gambit and the success of The Crown, and it shows that people want to watch historical fiction. My books can be tough because there are two timelines, and both of them are historical, which can be very expensive. You're not only 1919, but you have to kind of create the 1960s. But yeah, I think that'd be great. We'll see what happens. Fingers crossed.
At least with the Magnolia Palace, the 1966 timeline wouldn't be too terrible just because they're in the Frick most of the time. So,
That's true. That's true. That helps a lot, actually. Yeah, I
yeah.
hadn't thought of that. And what's funny about that is, for anyone who hasn't read it, that timeline is very limited. It's two characters over the course of 3 days, basically locked in at the Frick, trying to solve this scavenger hunt. And I realized after someone said to me, "Oh, you quarantined them." And it's true. I wrote it during 2020, and I think I subconsciously put my characters in quarantine. Nice.
I didn't connect that either, but that's true. Yeah. Arnisa is asking, what do you know now that you wish you had known as an author just starting out?
Ooh, Anissa, you have such good questions. I think, you know what, I would say I would, I think I would have just said to myself, okay, as you're writing a book, for me, it takes about a year and a half, and there's ups and downs. So you have times where it's going really well and you feel like, yeah, or, I'm on fire. This is going to be great. And then you get the edits back from your editor or your agent and you think, oh my goodness, this is horrible. I don't know if I can do it. And every book, it's that cycle. And it's just the fact of working on anything creative and working alone on something creative, because you don't know its worth until you get other eyes on it. And that's where I think being a journalist helped, because you knew the editor was going to help you shape it. And you relied on them
Mm-hmm.
to make your story better.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same with this, you can't see the forest for the trees sometimes. And, you'll get a note about, okay, whoa, what exactly happened? And in my head, it's very clear, but on the page, it's not.
Yes.
And it happened, I'm on my 7th book now, and it's still that same cycle. And it's a matter of not getting discouraged, of just fighting through and sticking with it, and sticking with the discomfort
Mm-hmm.
of creating anything, because you're going to hit it. It's not going to be fun all the time. But if you push through that discomfort, you end up with a really solid work.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what you want to get to. It's just not easy.
Yeah. There was a tweet from Kate Claiborne, who writes contemporary romance, but I think she's on similar, like book 8 or 9 or something like that. Anyway, she said, why is it that every time you sit down to write, you think, I have completely forgotten how to do this? It does feel like that sometimes. You're like starting the next one, you're like, I don't know.
Right. And then you read someone's book. I just read Anne Leary wrote a book that just came out called The Foundling, which is historical fiction. It's a great book. Highly recommend it. And you read a book like that and you just think, wow, it's so incredible to see a finished product and read a book that just is so engaging and captivating and surprising that again, it makes you go, okay, why am I doing this? And then it makes you think, okay, I can get better. I'm going to get better. And I think that's that always need to improve. How can I improve? What can I learn?
Mm-hmm.
And as I'm reading a book, I'm always thinking, wow, she did that well. How did she do it?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think the aspect of learning craft as you read is just critical. I have that same experience. Kate Quinn's The Rose Code I read
Oh,
like months ago, and I just had like a book hangover where I was just like, I can't.
mhm.
It's just okay.
Oh,
And her,
and 3 different characters, multiple timelines, and she just nailed it. You cannot put that book down.
yeah. And the amount of research that she did. And when you read her author's note, when she's talking about, oh, and then this person did this, and this person was a real person, and this is why I changed this name slightly. And you're like, oh my God.
My favorite note on her author's note was like, the drugstore in chapter 13 doesn't actually exist. I'm like, oh my God. To get that level of veracity is just, oh my
Right, yeah,
God.
exactly. I also read, I think it was a Lisa Kleypas book. She writes historical romance, and in one of her notes, she also had to write about the Cinderella myth or the Cinderella story. Like when were pumpkins introduced
Oh,
to France, so that people weren't like, oh, well, that's not true. She like went bullet point by bullet point, and that for me, as also as an author, was like one of those points where it's like, okay, so I'm going to try to make sure that my author's notes are very complete. Okay.
yeah.
So,
Oh
oh,
my God.
Susan Sullivan says, I love The Rose Code, my favorite Kate Quinn, but I haven't read Diamond Eye. Neither have I. I haven't read it yet. Everyone says it's just as good. So,
And by the way, Kate Quinn is one of the nicest, most. Someone's just writing about the community of authors who are so supportive, and Kate Quinn is right up there. I reached out to her the other day with a question, and she reached right back and was so helpful, and oh, it's amazing.
yeah, yes. I've actually reached out to her and asked her to be on here as well. And so right now we've got it slated for 23 because everybody's so busy right now with deadlines. So it is a hard time.
Great. I'll watch that. I can't wait.
Yeah. And then we also had Michael Lee. He was saying your previous journalism career gives you a leg up in writing historical novels. and the process actually makes you a better writer, even if it takes a little more time for you to get into writing. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think it just gives you just a little more support. And for me, a lot of my books are really based on the heavy research because that gives me a framework that I then plop a fictional story on top of. But I
Hmm.
need that framework. It's very important. But at the same time, speaking of former careers, as an actress, that helped as well. But that helped in terms of the fictional world that I have to create
Oh.
because as an actress, you know, you're on stage and you're kind of moving people around in space, and how do you make the scene go forward? What can your character do physically to make the scene move forward? And you can put that right into a scene of a book in
Hmm.
terms of keeping character, keeping the scene dynamic, you know, having people doing things that kind of reflect what their state of mind is at that moment. And that's what you do as an actor. And then on top of that, I think just reading a lot of plays and reading so much dialogue and seeing how much can be said with just dialogue.
Hmm.
And that helps when it comes to writing, you know, a scene with two characters chatting away.
And I feel like you did that with the Magnolia Palace with Lillian because she doesn't answer questions very often. She doesn't. Like people put things on her and she just doesn't tell them no. She's just like, okay, and then walks away. I mean, it goes from the all right. Anissa said, "Can we go back to spoilers?" I'm gonna just go back to spoilers for what I'm about to say anyway. And Anissa, by all means, if you have more questions or you just want to talk about it. Okay, spoiler alert again for Magnolia Palace. I'm gonna put up that graphic too, so we know which book we're talking about.
Nice, nice.
When you're ready. Um, what so with Lillian and the first thing that happens is Mr. Warnick, I think, the landlord,
Mhm.
is trying to have some sort of romantic encounter with her, and she doesn't put him off. She's just says later, and then the police come, and she doesn't say I didn't do it. She just says I'll be right back, and then when she's out on the streets and she wanders into the Frick residence, is there to interview. They're like, "Oh, this is what you're doing," and she was like, "Sure." And Lillian's, "Oh, you're a private secretary?" And she's like, "Oh." And that just happens over and over again where she's just like, I'm here."
That is so interesting. And you know what it comes from? It's her character of, you know, since the age of what, 14, being a muse to sculptors, where she would walk into a studio and they would say, all right, we want you to be truth, we want you to be beauty, we want you to be, you know, and that's what she did. She would stand there still for hours as they made her into whatever they wanted her to be.
Yeah, and I think that you did a great job with that because she even in the narrative portions of her scenes, she will say, "Oh, I'll tuck my chin down because that makes it seem like I am more maternal, and they will, respond better to me that way." And she's very aware, and it made me think that you must know as an actress is I played piano for dancers, ballet dancers, and they were so aware of their body, and like even just how you would turn your wrist for something was so critical to the shape they were trying to achieve. And so I imagine that must be the same thing as an actress where you're like, oh, this is going to hit light better and it's going to reflect this way, and so it's going to give this impression.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. You know, it because you're doing a scene and let's say it's a comedic scene and you get a laugh on a certain line every night, and then one night you don't. And it's fun, the actor's brain, you start going, okay, what did I faced out or I paused right before I said the line. And actors, we do this all the time of, you know, okay, how do I get the laugh? But you figure out all the tiny little techniques that happen to get that audience response, whether it's laughter or you know, they're shocked or they're crying. You're always aware that there's an audience out there as you're moving around in space, and how can you pull them into you? How can you bring them in?
Yeah, yeah. I had that also when I was performing with piano. I would You'd always judge, you'd listen to the space between the notes. So you'd be like, is this a good, oh, yep, I got him. Okay. And then you can keep going because you'd know where you were, where their attention was.
Yes, yes. And I'm sure you could, as a piano player, also kind of cause the dancers to dance differently depending on how you hit, how you kind of hit the song or the notes. Which
Mhm.
must be so interesting.
Well, it was interesting too, like, I would play a lot of Beatles tunes for them, just during the regular practice, and it was interesting to see how they would, change and how the mood of the class would change if I played Beatles versus if I played classical, like Strauss and Chopin and things that they're very accustomed to hearing. I also had a whole repertoire of Russian music that I have no idea. I mean, it's all no idea what the words say, but that would change how they were as well, and it was just really fascinating to see. Yeah, it would alter. Sorry, we are now talking about me, and that is not the
No,
point.
no, I love this. I love that because, for me, every book has some kind of art form in it. It could be art history, like with Magnolia Palace. It could be, jazz, which is the first book. I'm always just really interested in how the arts affect our lives because I think it's so important to include them and incorporate them into what we do every day.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, so I'm just fascinated by what you do. I mean, that's a great book right there.
Yeah, it's a dying skill, unfortunately.
The studio musician, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And Nisa wanted to know, when you were writing Helen Frick, did you want to pull your hair out at times? I believe she had to be an extremely difficult character to write.
Yeah, I loved her. I love cranky women. I think I really do. I love nothing better than writing, an 80-year-old angry woman. That's my voice for some reason. That's like my innate voice. And so Helen was great because, I remember reading this article in the New Yorker that described her as a woman of extremely robust prejudices. And she was like, if her friends bobbed their hair, which was very popular in the 20s, she dropped them. She wore this pompadour and a bun most of her entire adult life. And so she was fun to write. I found the more I made her just dug into what she felt was right and, objectionable and difficult. There's a scene in the book where she and her father fight over whether he should wear his overcoat or not.
I
And
love it.
that's taken from the biography. Yeah. I
I
mean,
love
so
that because it was that, like, doing it. I'm not doing it. Like, it was the whole, yeah.
right, right, and this weird kind of odd relationship between the two of them of this kind of love-hate thing. And for if you're writing a book, you have these characters and for me, the more difficult they are and the more obstacles they have in front of them, the better.
Mhm.
Because that's what takes the readers on a journey that's dynamic and interesting, and that makes them turn the page. You don't want someone who's easygoing
Yes.
because, that's no fun.
I actually really even enjoyed the scene of Helen hiring Lillian
Yeah.
because she's like, "Oh, well, so if you're not good at it, great. I
Yeah.
That's a plus."
Right. Right. 'Cause she says, I think she asks her, do you have good handwriting? And Lillian says, no. And she says, good. I like to be difficult, or I like things.
Yeah, it was great. Yeah, I really enjoyed it because it is, because that had come right on I think it came right on the heels of the overcoat getting thrown out, that you just really have this, like, "I teach my dad a lesson about this," then, that just very entertaining.
And you have these two women who are very different, but they both speak the language of art. And
Mhm.
so because of that, they do form a really deep connection.
Yeah. Yeah, and I do appreciate towards the end of the book that, um, she does come in with the idea of, like, "Of course I was naked.
Mhm.
How do you think that comes to be? Like, where did you think that comes from?" And Helen's just like, "Oh, oh, never thought
Yeah.
about it."
Yeah, and I was so curious about this idea that, someone like Audrey Munson or Lillian back in the 1910s, if you posed nude for sculptors, you were considered bohemian, outrageous. You would never be allowed into the upper class. Yet the upper classes were the ones who were buying this art and displaying it in their homes
Mhm.
without the thought of how does it come to be and at what expense? Who are the people who actually who formed it?
Yeah. And it's another aspect of actually what you have in the steel magnate who's exploiting the worker, but you're also as you're exploiting the art as well. You're exploiting the subjects of the art.
Yeah.
It's really not that far apart of a concept.
No, no, I hadn't thought of that, but you're right. Yeah.
Yeah. We have another question from Anissa saying, "What did your characters teach you in this book?"
Ooh, interesting. The characters, I don't know if they actually teach me something. I love going on the journey of coming up with the idea of a character, and I do a really deep character dive into them as I figure out who they are before I write anything. And figure out what are their weaknesses, what are their strengths, what are their obstacles, what can I do, what happened to them when they were young, and I figure all that out. And then as I write, of course, they change, and it's always so interesting when I'm done with the book and to go back to those early character studies and see how they've changed, because that really is the character kind of coming to life on the page and telling me what it wants. So yeah, there's always a ton of surprises, but at the same time, as the author, you are in control of what they're doing and what they need to do because they have to serve the story no matter what.
Yes.
Mhm.
I did actually in my last book. I had that experience of I had my whole outline. I knew where we were going, and then in like chapter 5, she was supposed to go off and take this adventure with this someone, and I'm writing the scene, and she's like, "Oh, I'm not doing that. Not an idiot. I'm not doing that." Ah, crap. She's right. She wouldn't do that.
Ooh, what did you do? Did you change it?
I did. I changed it and I had to rewrite a little bit of the outline, but I think in the end it made it more interesting because it was the character herself putting up a roadblock saying, "That's asinine. No."
Yes,
And
that's great. It reminds me of working on the Chelsea Girls. I had two characters and they were in love, and I started writing this scene where something was supposed to happen, and they started breaking up during it. And I was sort of like, "Whoa, what's going on?" But it was the right thing for the book. That was correct, although it was the strangest experience.
yeah, yeah, and that was the same thing. They were supposed to be coming together and instead apart, and it was like, "Wait, where are you guys going? We need to be here."
I'm so amazed by people who can sit down without an outline and just write and see where it goes. I can't do that. I need to know where the story's headed, but at the same time, I think you're right. You can't be married to it because
Yeah.
otherwise you might miss an opportunity.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I don't think I could. I know that there are some writers who have very extensive outlines
Mhm.
where they're going, subplot point and I can't. I mean, they say that it helps them write faster, and I've looked into trying it out, but that's
Yeah.
not how my brain works. That's just, you get into it, and you're in this place, and in your mind, you're standing in these locations, and
Yeah. Yeah.
so I don't know. It seems it's magical when it happens, and I don't know.
It is, it is. It's amazing. It's almost like we have this movie in our head and we're just writing it out, basically.
Mhm,
We're just
mhm.
taking dictation for the movie that's running in our heads all the time, by the way.
Yes.
You can't shake it.
Yeah, I've actually had recently the issue where I sat down to work again after a really busy time on my book, and I opened up my document and I was like, "That's as far as I got?" Because in my head, I had so much already plotted out that,
Yeah.
I already knew scene by scene, I knew it was happening, I had the dialogue, I had everything, and then, "Oh, I haven't written it out yet. Oh, got it. Alright.
Well, I have to do this. Yeah.
Oh." Susan Seligman is asking, do you have difficulty saying goodbye to your characters when you finish a book, or are you ready to put them to bed and focus on new characters for your next story?
It's funny, the publishing world, because you finish the manuscript and you get it into your editor, and then you go through copyrights and proofreading, and you're so sick of it by that point because you're trying to catch every mistake, and you won't get everyone, and you're just it's crazy. But then it gets into the pipeline and it's off. Sales are dealing with it, marketing, the editors. It's out of your hands, so you start working on the next book. But for me, what's lovely is about 6 months later is when it gets published, 6 months to a year. And so then suddenly you're busy writing another book and you're called back to revisit that one. And it's such an interesting experience because it's really like seeing old friends again and
Mm,
going and doing author talks and, revisiting them after taking a break so that it feels fresh and interesting and you're making all these different connections that you hadn't made before. So for me, as I do author talks, I feel like I'm completely revisiting the book every time. So they never go to bed.
yeah. Well, that's interesting. Um, all right, and Nisa wants to know, what are your most anticipated summer reads?
Oh, okay. Jamie Brenner has a book coming out called Guilt. It's about a jewelry designer set partly in New York, partly in Provincetown. It's great. Really, really good. Um,
Oh,
Amy Popel. Yeah.
sorry, just to clarify, is it Guilt, Guil?
G-I-L. No, it's G-I-L-T, like
Okay,
guilt of a, yes, yes.
not like gilding, but yeah, okay,
Yes,
just want to make
exactly.
sure.
Amy Popel has a book called The Sweet Spot, which is coming out sometime maybe. Oh, you know what? That's actually coming out next year. But that's fantastic and wonderful. And then Linda Cohen Leugman has an amazing book called The Matchmaker, and that's set in New York City, two timelines, Lower East Side. It's just a great book about a Jewish girl who's has a gift of being a matchmaker,
Oh,
and
that's
it's really great. And that's coming out soon. And then there's a book by Lori Albanese called Hester that comes out, I think, September, October, and that's the Scarlet Letter from Hester's point of view. Kind of, it's really beautifully done. There's so many layers to it. So
awesome.
yeah, there's a lot coming out.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That I sometimes the hardest thing is that you have so many books to read. I've heard recently statistics that there's 1 million books coming out publishing every year. 1 million.
Oh my god. Oh
And
my
it's,
goodness. But there's some great ones that I've just read, like Lessons in Chemistry.
ooh, who's Lessons in Chemistry?
Oh, by Bonnie. If I need one of our readers here to fill me in on her last name. Um, Bonnie Maim. And anyway, it's called Lessons in Chemistry. It takes place in the 60s of this woman scientist who ends up starting a cooking show. And it's smart. The voice is brilliant. I hope it's being optioned for a movie because it would be a great movie. And it's just great. Is anyone, Anissa, do you know who, can you give us the last name of the author? I love crowdsourcing this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I can Google it, but I will take away from this. Yeah.
See if it comes up.
Yeah. Oh, and Susan said that she read Linda's book. We loved it. Oh man, isn't it the best win? I love winning arcs.
Yes. Oh, I love that you went an arc. Yes, Bonnie Marmus. Thank you, Anissa. Bonnie Marmus wrote Lessons in Chemistry.
Right. Yeah, I'm writing all these down. I also review for Historical Novel Society, so
Oh yeah.
I'm on the big lists that come out, and it's like, okay,
Ah,
which ones am I gonna? What am I gonna get? I'll see.
I love getting that magazine every
Yeah,
month. I just love it. Like there's something about it. It's like so much information and when you see something has a star, you're like, oh yes, it's
yeah,
fantastic.
yeah. And I love that it's organized in the back by time period. So
Yes.
oh, maybe I feel a little Roman today.
Go medieval.
I really like that. Yeah. And then Susan was saying that she met Linda several times before COVID. Well, that's pretty.
Yeah. Yeah,
I know.
she'll be on tour.
Yeah. So are you doing any more talks coming up, or do you have any tours or anything like that planned?
Yeah, there's been a lot. It's so much fun. Just 2 days ago, or a few days ago, I did a private talk with the director of the Frick, Ian Wardropper, who we had a conversation that was just in a dinner after. It was just great to be able to talk Frick. Bonnie Garmus, sorry. Okay, Bonnie Garmus is not Marmus, Garmus, Garmus is Lessons in Chemistry.
Uh,
And yeah, there's some things. There's something going down in New Jersey later. There's the Mark Twain House. I'm doing a talk there in July. I'm doing a talk out at Sag Harbor or in Bridgehampton in July out in the East End. So if you go on my website, the events page of Fiona Davis Books, you can see all the talks, and it's pretty steady. I needed to have a toe operation, so I had to kind of pull back and not do as much, but now I'm starting to get a little more mobile, which is nice. Oh, and I see Susie says she'll be at my talk at Third Place Books, which that is with next Thursday evening with it's for another author, Tara Moss, who writes amazing. She's Australian and she writes like a gumshoe detective, a woman in
Uh-huh.
Australia in the 1940s.
Oh, that
And
sounds
so
really
there's this whole film noir thing to it. And her characters are great. It's a series, and I can't wait. Her latest one is called The Ghosts of Paris, and it's beautifully written. She's so talented. And that's Tara Moss. I want to make sure everybody picks up that book.
all right. I'm getting that down too. I know. Well, like I can add more books, but I'm gonna add more to be read book because you can't stop. And I just want to let everyone know that if you want to keep up with Fiona, you can also go to her Instagram. And of course, there's always the Facebooks if you're on the Facebooks. So that's another way to keep up with everything you're doing.
Yeah, and it's great because I post a lot about the research there. So you can go and see the 60s model that my character Veronica is based on. And if you dig deep enough, you can find some fun images there. And you can see some of the statues that Audrey Munson actually posed for and some shots of her. So that's kind of fun.
It is interesting that the standards of beauty have changed so much. Like this is not a figure that it's not curvy enough for our mainstream. I'm going to hold it up one more time so you can kind of see it there.
Yeah.
If you think about if you were going to put an idealized, ours would be a little different if we did it today.
Yeah, she had very curvy hips, which a model today could not have.
Yeah.
Although I hope things are changing because that would be nice.
It's who knows? It's always in flux, it seems like. Hard to keep up with.
It's true.
All right. Well, so I've covered everything, including the books that you're most looking forward to. So you guys, if you have any more questions for Fiona, you can see if you can beat the clock here because we are wrapping up, or you can always find her again I'm going to pop these back up. It's at Fiona Davis at Instagram, or Fiona Davis author, and the same thing on Facebook. So if you guys have any more questions, or have desperate need to ask her some questions,
please reach out. Thank you so much. This was just terrific. I feel like we could go on for another 2 hours. It's lovely.
Really good. Yes, absolutely. This was a great time.
All right, for joining in.
Yeah. I'm well, and I'm really looking forward to your next book. It'll be fantastic.
Thank you.
So yeah, thanks again for being here.
All right, take care, everybody.
All right, guys. I'm so glad you guys joined us, and I'm so glad that you asked wonderful and brilliant of her. Just to pop up, I didn't get a chance to do this. These are all of her books, so you can always take a look through any of these. We talked about almost every single one of them, I think. We didn't talk as much about the address as the other ones. And coming up on Tuesday, if you join our Facebook group, Shine, we are giving away a Kindle jam-packed with historical fiction on it. So you can enter there on Tuesday, June 7th. So you can join today and get a chance to enter to win a brand new Kindle with a Kindle Fire 8 and a bunch of really good historical fiction. And we are going to take the month of July off for these tea lights, but we're going to come back in August and we'll be chatting with Evie Dunmore, who wrote Bringing Down the Duke, A Rogue of One's Own, and Portrait of a Scotsman. Her fourth is coming out. I just blanked on the date it's coming out, but I believe it's coming out in early 23. All right, so I will see you guys in August. I hope you have a wonderful few summer months and stay cool.